Okay, so my name is Devin Knight. I'm the lead trainer here at PowerPivot Works. I run the training department. You can see my contact information, and I'm on Twitter as well if you do Twitter. So here's really the main tools that we're going to focus in on for today. We're going to look at Excel services. This is basically Excel, but the web-based Excel inside of SharePoint. We're going to look at Report Builder and really the ad hoc portions of that, because really you have a lot of flexibility in Report Builder where you can create from the ground up reports as well as pick and choose pieces of reports that you want to pull from pre-canned parts of a report. We're also going to talk about PowerPivot, which is kind of an ad hoc modeling tool as well as an ad hoc reporting tool. And then we'll get into PowerView, which really has several aspects of it there. You see I have three product icons there because it involves SharePoint, it involves SQL Server, and it could, as a third option, it involves Excel 2013. So if you're using Excel 2013, then it doesn't necessarily have to involve SharePoint, because you can do PowerView all just inside of Excel 2013. So we'll talk about these. We'll get much more in depth in them as we get going, and we'll be very demo heavy today. So we're going to take this from the perspective of I'm the user. I want to create some content, share it on SharePoint, and have others be able to consume it as well. All right, so the first one we're going to look at here is Excel services. That's just a picture of the Excel interface from the web. It's a really quick and dirty way of doing ad hoc reporting. You'll find a lot of people use Excel for just generating those quick numbers. I need to see what was revenue like in January of 2012. So make a quick pivot table out of it inside of Excel, and that is a great reason to use Excel for ad hoc reporting. It also shares very well inside of inside of SharePoint, and you'll find that now with SharePoint 2013, there's been a lot of enhancements to that. There's a new concept inside of Excel services called Excel Interactive View, which if you're using SharePoint 2013 will allow you to still interact with pivot tables that have been deployed to SharePoint. In previous versions, once you deployed out your pivot table to SharePoint, it was you weren't able to change what columns were part of your report. You weren't able to change any of the metadata. You could just basically interact with an existing pivot table that you created. So there's a lot of new functionality that Excel Interactive View is part of Excel 2013. But basically what Excel services is it's a web-based way of doing Excel pivot tables. So I can create an Excel workbook, deploy it off to SharePoint, and then have others be able to interact with it just as if I did it on their desktop client. So if they had a desktop client of Excel, I want them to have that same look and feel, but in a web-based environment. Like I mentioned, there's been some major enhancements to Excel 2013, and I'm going to show you those right now. So I'm just doing demos all through Excel 2013 today and SharePoint 2013, so you get the latest and greatest stuff. I will make sure to point out what things are not available in 2010 or 2007. So as we get going, I'll make sure to point out what's brand new. Okay, so we're looking at an Excel workbook here, just an empty workbook. And what I'd like to do is show you the client side first. So this is just Excel client-side tool here. And then we'll deploy it off to SharePoint and see what benefits SharePoint gets us in the whole scheme of Excel services here. All right, so I'm going to connect up to some data that I have inside of, let's say, an analysis services cube that I want to create pivot tables off of. IT has created this analysis services cube for me. I now want to connect to it as an end user and be able to build some basic reports off of it. So to do so, again, I'm inside of Excel here. I'll go to my Data tab here, tell it that I want to create a connection from other sources, and then select Analysis Services. So again, this is from a user perspective. They could go through each of these steps. And all they need is read access to that Analysis Services cube or database. Now, of course, they'd have to know the server that they're connecting to. So in my case, I would type in my server name and hit Next. Okay. Once I hit Next, I'd select the Analysis Services database up top here, and then the cube inside that database that I'd like to connect to. So in my case here, I've selected the AdventureWorks database, and then I have a whole list of different cubes and perspectives that I can select from. I'm going to select from the very top one that has the completed AdventureWorks cube, and then I'll hit Next. Now this does create a Office data connection file here. That's an ODC file that you see listed here. This can also be part of Excel services where rather than storing that as a local file on my laptop or on my machine, I could actually have it stored on SharePoint and allow it to use different authentication. So you'll see there's an Excel Services button here on the bottom, the authentication settings, where I can actually tell it how to pull in the credentials that it should use to connect to the cube. So if I don't necessarily want to grant access to each individual to the cube, I can have an unattended service account basically, or an unattended account that can run all of my reports for me. And you can set those up ahead of time. You can use a stored credentials or stored account and then have that application ID that you enter in here. And then that allows you, again, to have those credentials stored ahead of time, and then you can easily bring those into Excel Services. Saves you a lot of time, and it saves you from having to grant individuals or a lot of groups access to your cube. Okay, for our purposes here, I'm just going to go ahead and leave this as a local file and hit Finish. And then I'll create a basic pivot table. Now for us, I did a pivot table here, but I could just as easily have done a pivot chart as well. Now you'll see I have all kinds of different objects available to me in my pivot table field list on the far right. I can bring in any of my columns or that are coming from either my measure groups or my dimensions here. Or if I wanted to, here's kind of a neat thing with Excel 2013, is I can deploy this empty spreadsheet just as it is, deploy this off into SharePoint, and allow others to create their own pivot tables off of it to get those quick and dirty answers that we talked about. So they just have a quick question. How many sales did we have in January of 2012? They could create a very quick pivot table off of this workbook that I create and get those quick answers. So here's how that could work. If I wanted to, I could take this very basic workbook that we've created, go up to my File menu and tell it I want to save this off to SharePoint. I have my SharePoint option here. And I want to save this off. I'm going to save it to my PowerPivot gallery. Now we're going to talk about PowerPivot in a little bit, but you can actually use the PowerPivot gallery kind of as a central repository for a lot of your reports. So I'm going to select the PowerPivot gallery here. Just going to connect up to my server. Normally doesn't take that long. I did just reboot my machine here before we got started. Let me make sure that I'm able to connect to everything. Okay. I'll give that another second or two. But once we connect that up and we actually deploy this off into our PowerPivot gallery, it basically is going to give my users the ability to create their own pivot tables in a web interface. The really, really neat thing about how this is going to work, here finally it's catching up to me. The neat thing about how this is going to work is once I deploy this out, we'll call this my Excel Services example. I'll place the one I already have out there. There we go. Is it basically gives my users the capability of doing everything that I've done here inside the Excel environment now in the web interface. Now, of course, you don't have a lot of the formatting that you can do, but anything that has to do with the pivot table of adding new columns or moving around columns or adding filters is now going to be available to those users from the web interface. So I'm going to open up my SharePoint site here. Go to my PowerPivot gallery where I just deployed out that Excel Services example sheet, our workbook, right here. And I'll select that Excel Services example, and you'll see exactly what Excel Services looks like now inside of SharePoint 2013. It's much improved over the previous versions. It's running a little slow right now, though. Here we go. Uh-oh. Oh, I had an issue there. We'll try it one more time. That's funny. I tested it right before we got on here. Now, one thing you'll notice here as well is you'll see this little time indicator here. This is just indicating that it's probably still uploading is why I got that error message. Machine ran a little bit slow here after my reboot. But what we're going to get is when I can actually open this, there it goes, is all the capabilities of what I could do in pivot tables inside of Excel, I now have in a web interface. Notice what my interface here is actually Internet Explorer, where I'm able to connect to any of my different measure groups here. I can select the measure groups that I'd like to base my report off of. I could bring KPIs in here very easily. I have a lot of the same capabilities, again, that I would have from the client tool now inside of the web interface here of Excel Services. So I could create a basic report here, and it's all being done inside of SharePoint or in the web interface. And that's the real interesting part that takes us far and above what you could do in previous versions of SharePoint, where you can stay interactive with this. So if you were using Excel 2010, you can deploy out pivot tables, and you could do basic things like expanding hierarchies that you have, That can all be done inside of Excel 2010, but the key part that's been an improvement in Excel 2013 is the capability to change the metadata that we have here. So if I decided instead of seeing the date, do you have a question, Melissa?
Yes, I do. I have about 3 people in the audience saying that they do not have any audio. Do we have anybody else in the audience that's having trouble?
Okay, looks like everybody's good.
Okay, thanks.
So that's a really key part that's different here, is having the ability to still interact and be able to change the metadata that's part of the report. So that's going to be a great piece of it here. All right. Some people saying they don't have audio, but they must have some audio if they're telling us that they have audio. All right, so that's Excel services. Very simple. That's deploying out our workbook to a web interface and still being able to interact with it and make data refreshes. So I can refresh the data that I have in my connection and easily be able to pull that information in. Okay? All right, let's look at our next type of ad hoc reporting tool. Some of these are going to be pretty quick. Excel services is a very easy to implement feature, and that's why we can knock out that one pretty quickly here. All right, so we talked about Excel services. The next one we're going to talk about is Report Builder. Now, a lot of people wouldn't necessarily consider this much of an ad hoc reporting tool because of the nature of reporting services. Reporting services in itself is a much more deliberate tool. It takes a little while to actually develop in it. But there are some functionalities within inside of Report Builder that allow your users to easily create reports on their own. Hence, it is a form of an ad hoc reporting tool here. It's more of a formal tool, though, because you're able to create some more formal reports that have parameters and have the capability of having maps in them, and it can create more pixel-perfect reporting using Report Builder. Report Builder is a click-once application. What that means is if your users don't have it installed already, whenever they go to use SharePoint, it will actually download and install it for them automatically. And it really has just basically all the same functionality that you would have as a developer. So those of you that are reporting services developers in the audience, it has all the same capabilities that Visual Studio does, except for a few things here and there, like being able to create multiple reports at the same time is not available in Report Builder. Now, what you'll really find is beneficial from an ad hoc reporting perspective is that you may want to take advantage of some of the features like shared data sets and report parts. These are really beneficial from an ad hoc perspective because you as a developer, or those of you that are developers, can create those data sets and report parts ahead of time, and then users can consume those inside their reports using Report Builder. So it's made really simple inside Report Builder to do that too. In fact, if you have a lot of different report parts, they can easily be consumed by searching through your SharePoint site. So again, we're doing this through SharePoint today, but Report Builder can also be done without SharePoint. So if you don't have SharePoint in your environment and you have just reporting services, Report Builder is consumable through just the regular native reporting services interface as well. All right, so let's take a look at Report Builder. On my SharePoint site that we were looking at, I have a library. So it's a SharePoint library that I'm going to show you here. And I've named it here Reporting Services Library. Okay. Now inside this library, I had to turn on a couple features, and I won't go through showing you that right now, but I did have to turn on a couple features to make sure that this library could consume reporting services objects, meaning reports, data sets, data sources, that sort of thing. And once I've done that, once I've turned on those objects, I'm now able to create new reports. So I can go up to my File menu here and say that I want to create a new document, and it will allow me to launch open the Report Builder tool. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open up the Report Builder. Now inside the Report Builder, if you were to create a new report from scratch, there actually is some somewhat user-friendly capability in here to create reports and create data sets on your own. But if you're not comfortable creating data sets off of cubes, for example, you could leverage things that developers have developed. So as I mentioned earlier, you could use things like a shared data set, deploy those shared data sets off to the server, and then your end users could consume those shared data sets from there as well. Same could be said for report parts. So report parts are basically pieces of a report, and then your users can consume those parts inside their own reports that they develop. Now what I'm going to show you first here is we're going to create a basic report, and I'm going to walk through the interface assuming I don't have things like shared data sets and report parts available to me, just so you can see the difference between the two and understand how much of a benefit it gets you as an end user to have those things pre-developed. So we're going to start by, it's very wizard-based in this. So if you've used the Visual Studio environment for reporting services, it is much more detailed and has many more knobs that you can turn. When you use the Report Builder tool, it's much more wizard-based. So you'll find that anything that you do usually has a wizard associated with it to walk you through it. And again, that's because this tool is built more for power users to be able to build out reports on. All right, so we're going to build a new report, and I'm going to build a table or matrix wizard here. You'll see that I can't optionally pull in a shared data set, but this first one I actually am going to create my own data set just to show you how simple or difficult you may think it is. So we're going to create a new data set here on the bottom and then hit next. Okay, now I can pull in a data source, and if I have a data source already stored on the server, then I can hit browse here and find that data source. Or if I need to create a new connection to a data source, I can simply hit new here. I actually have one on the server already, so I'll hit browse and then find in the folder location where I've stored that data source. Now it may actually, let's see if it picks my data source up here. Yeah, it certainly does. So I can see I have an AdventureWorks Analysis Services data source here that if I hit and click open, I'm now able to reuse an existing data source. I don't have to continually create the same data source over and over. My developer deployed out my data source, and now I can consume it. All right, I'll hit next here now that I've selected a data source to use, and it's going to walk me through creating a query. So this is the query that I'll use for the data set in the report. So I could go find inside this data set or build this data set and tell it that I want to bring in my sales that occurred on the internet. So I'll bring in internet sales. Okay. I may want to also bring in a parameter. I want to parameterize this so I can see how my sales did by year. Okay, so you can drag parameters up here to the very top section. This is actually the filter section up top here, but if you want to parameterize something, you simply check off this little parameter button on the far end, and that'll turn it into a reporting services parameter. You can also change the filter expression. This filter expression value that you check off is the default value that's going to be brought in whenever the report runs. So by default, I'm defaulting this to calendar year 2007, but I've made it a parameter so it can be changed to other values by the user. All right, so right now we're looking at internet sales 2007, but I also want to see this by, let's say, for example, my product list. So I want to see each of my products listed out on this report. So I'm just using this tool here to drag and drop and create my report. As you notice, I haven't had to actually write any code on my own. It's allowed me to do all drag and drop here. Now that's going to be the same for developers as well. Whenever developers create reports off of cubes, it will allow them to do drag and dropping to start off with. Now if I had selected SQL Server as my data source and I was a developer using Visual Studio, I would have to probably write out the query that I would like to pull in as a data set. But from Report Builder, if I were to connect it to SQL Server, it actually does give me another drag and drop interface where I can build out a query. It's not the best interface for building queries, but it is something to help end users be able to write SQL code. Now if I wanted to see what was going on under the covers, I've been doing all dragging and dropping here, but if I wanted to see exactly what's happening underneath, I can hit this little button up top here called Design Mode, and it'll show me the code that's being written for me. So you're always able to go look at that and see exactly what's going on with the code that's being created from this drag and drop interface. Okay, so I'm happy with this data set. I got a very small data set, but it'll work for me. So I'll hit Next. Okay. Now it's going to ask me where would I like to place these objects on my report, or where would I like to place these fields. So I could place things like the internet sales amount under the value section, and I probably want to see the products under the row groups. You can really drag them around to any section that you prefer. You can move them around very easily here. All right, I'll finally hit Next. It's going to ask me how do I want to lay out my report. Do I want to show subtotals and grand totals? Yeah, sure, we can go ahead and do that. And hit Next again. And then it'll ask you what kind of theme do you want to have, or style. How do you want to style your report? Just gives you different color coding that you can do here. It's just completely up to you here. And hit Next. And then we have our report. So I can hit Run in the top left, and this will preview my report for me so I can see exactly what I'm getting myself into here. This gives me a little preview that I'll be able to experience what the report can do before I deploy it off to the server. Now in this report you can see that I did create a parameter up top here, a year parameter where I can select the year that I'd like to see inside the report visualized. So I can change it to 2006 and hit View Report. And then you can see it does affect my data as well. Now that wizard that we just walked through is good in that it can create a very basic report very quickly, but it leaves out a lot of things like formatting. So things like this is a sales amount, I probably want to represent this data as a currency here. So things like that are actually really important get left out, and they're pretty easy to add back in. So for example, if I wanted to add formatting to this report, I could go back to design here, right-click on the cell that I want to add the formatting to, and go to the properties of the cell where I can give it a currency format. You could also apply formatting up here in the typical Office ribbon, where I can tell it that this is really a currency, and it's going to change the formatting of that cell to use the currency format. So you'll notice with Report Builder, they've tried to make this much more familiar to end users. So it uses kind of the Office look and feel up top here. If I want to insert a new report object, I'd select Insert here and be able to add it in. Very, very simple to do it. Now again, if I wanted to save this report, I could simply hit Save, tell it where do I want to save my report that we've created. So if this is where I want to save it, I could say this is my first SSRS report. It saves it off into my SharePoint site, and if I come refresh inside SharePoint, looks like it's still deploying. Thought I saved it. There it goes. Once I save that, I'll see my report here listed inside SharePoint, and if a user selects it, they'll be able to interact with it here and select their parameter just like we did in the preview mode. Okay. All right, so that's the first kind of report you can do in Report Builder. Let's take a look at some of the other things we talked about as well. We talked about how you can build reports using things like shared data sets or using things like report parts. Report parts are a really neat functionality. I'm going to show you that one next here. Now, let's say you have a developer that's really an expert in what they do. They know how to create maps. They know how to deal with geography data. They can create some really, really impressive reports for you. And they even do things like create dashboards. Well, the nice thing about reporting services, and this has been around since 2008 or 2, is there's a functionality here called report parts, where they can actually pick pieces of a report that they develop and deploy them off to the server. So for example, let's whiteboard this for a moment. If I were to create a dashboard, and I have things in here like a nasty pie chart. I really don't like pie charts, but that's a typical example of something that might be on a dashboard, unfortunately. So I create things like a pie chart, and I have a bar chart and things like that listed on my dashboard. And we'll get a line chart in here as well. So as I create this dashboard, as a developer, I can tell it that each of these parts of my dashboard can be deployed to my SharePoint site or to my report server individually. So I can deploy the dashboard as a whole, and I could also deploy each individual piece of my report as a report part. Now the benefit that gives me is now my end users can come onto my report server or my SharePoint site, see that I've deployed out these report parts, and they can basically steal them. They can steal them and make them part of their own report. So they can take out this bar chart that they really like, and they can create their own basic report that maybe has some tabular view of the data, and then they also want to include in your bar chart that you created. So it gives you some flexibility here where you can kind of use a combination of creating your own content and also stealing from the developer that knows what they're doing. Now the nice thing about this is that it will also bring across the data set that's included for that chart. So if I steal that bar chart and make it part of my report that I've created over here, it's not only going to bring across the report object, but it's also going to bring across the code. So any code that it took to return back that data is going to be brought along for the ride. So let's take a look at what this looks like from a user perspective. As a developer, I've already had my developers deploy out this report part here called US Retail Sales, and now I'm ready to consume it as an end user. So again, I'd go up to my File, New Document, and open up the Report Builder. That's the tool we looked at just a moment ago. And my goal here is to consume out this report part and use it in our report. Now rather than going through that whole wizard that we did a few moments ago, I'm just going to go and create a blank report here. Okay? And what I want to do here is I want to insert or bring in a report part, and that report part is living on my server right now. So I can go in here and say I want to insert from the insert menu at the top, select report part, and that report part button is going to open up this report part gallery here on the far right, where basically you can search your entire server for report parts. So if you have dozens or even hundreds of report parts, you could easily search through here by name or by the description of the report part. In our case, I only have one, so I can just hit the enter button here, and it gives me a list of all of them. And in my case, I only have one in my case here. You'll see it also gives you a little preview of what that report part is going to look like. In this case, I have a map. So my developer created a map for me, and I want to use that map as part of my report. So without having to do any extra development, again, all I did was I opened up Report Builder, and I told it I want to insert a report part. And all I have to do now is just select and drag in that report part. And now I've actually consumed something that a developer created and made it my own. Okay? So I've placed it inside my report. Here my interface is a little small here. Let me make it a little larger. I've brought in that report part, and I can go and I can preview this report and see what it looks like. Now again, we haven't written any code this time. We just went straight into inserting a report part, and we see that whoever created this report part earlier had a parameter in the data set that it used, and they can select the parameter values, and you'll notice here as I change the year that we should see the report change. A little bit of the colors change there. So we have an interactive report, again, that I didn't have to know how to do because someone else developed it for me. I wanted to use the best parts of it that I liked and brought it into my report here. Now, again, to show you, I'm going to flip back to the design section here. Back in the design section, if I wanted to look at the report part, or really the components of the report part, one of it is the map itself. The other one is I have a data set. I really have two data sets here. There's two data sets here, one for the year drop-down box parameter, and then the other one here that's bringing in the retail sales by state. And that's all been brought in from the report part, even the parameter. So the parameter up top here, the year parameter has been all brought in for me automatically, and I didn't have to do any development on my part. So I really like this piece of a report that the developer did, and I want to bring it into my own report. Very neat functionality that you have here. All right, so now let's ask, many of you are probably asking yourself this question is, okay, well, I like that, but what if the developer changes the report part and they redeploy it out? They make a change and they redeploy it, and I want to make sure I get those changes that they have. Well, the neat thing about report parts is you get to make the decision on whether you want to consume those changes or not. As of right now, this report part is basically just part of your report, and it's on your own from here on out. Or you could also, optionally, update based on what the developer changes. So if the developer goes in and they make a change to this map, I could go up to my little menu button in the top left and tell it to check for updates, and it'll reach out and see if there's any updates on my report parts. In this case, there's been 0 updates. But I can choose whether I want to consume that update or not, or I could just continue along with using the original part of the chart here. So nice flexibility here that you have to either consume or leave your part of the report as it is. But it keeps that connection between the part that you can always have that ability to go back and refresh if you wanted. All right, so that's the report parts. The other thing was the data sets. The shared data sets can be consumed easily in here as well. But I want to move on here a little bit. All right, so let's talk about next PowerPivot. PowerPivot is kind of an ad hoc modeling and reporting tool. So not only can you very quickly create reports, which is what we're mainly focused on, but you can also create models. Models meaning kind of like what I showed with my first example. When I showed that I connected to an analysis services cube, you could basically create all that on your own and not have to wait for IT. So if you're tired of having to wait for long cycle processes of your IT department creating a data warehouse where it takes 6 months or a year for a data warehouse to be complete or even prototyped, you can use PowerPivot to kind of prototype out what you want that data warehouse to look like. And you don't have to actually build out a data warehouse. You don't have to use any kind of ETL tool to bring all those different objects together. You can do it all inside of PowerPivot. So if you have multiple data sources even, maybe you have a SQL Server data source that has your sales data in it, and you have an Oracle data source that has your finance data in it, you can merge those two together inside PowerPivot without having to do anything really. You don't have to contact IT, other than having to have read access to both of those. So if you have read access to both those data sources, then you can pull them into PowerPivot find the relationships, and build out a model. So you definitely have to have some security access. You need to have at least read access to any of the data sources you want to use. Now you can schedule the data to be refreshed. So by default, when you use PowerPivot and you import data, that data immediately becomes static once it's inside of PowerPivot. PowerPivot, by the way, and maybe I should do some little prefacing here, PowerPivot is an add-in for Excel. It's actually something you can do inside of Excel in Excel 2010 or up. In 2010, this was a free add-in that you could download and do your modeling all inside of Excel 2010. In 2013, it's now included automatically, and you don't have to do any additional download. But basically, it's going to hyper-compress the data. So all this data that I bring in, millions and millions of rows of data that I pull in, can all be brought into Excel now inside of PowerPivot. So a lot of those row limitations that you may have run into previously with Excel are out the door whenever you use PowerPivot, especially the 64-bit version of PowerPivot. Now, again, we talked about a problem here. I import all this data inside of PowerPivot, and it's immediately stale. As soon as I pull it in, it loses that connection to my data source unless I go and manually refresh it. And that's where SharePoint comes in handy. When you're using SharePoint, you can schedule the data to be automatically refreshed inside those PowerPivot workbooks. Using the PowerPivot gallery, which I showed briefly a few moments ago, and I'll talk much more in depth about here as we go forward, using the PowerPivot library, PowerPivot gallery, and it's a library, I can automatically schedule data refreshes to occur on my PowerPivot workbooks, and that way I don't have any manual process of clicking the refresh button here, and it saves you a lot of time. So we talked about how you would deploy these off to the PowerPivot gallery, and then that's where you'll have the ability to schedule those data refreshes. All right, so let's look at creating a basic model and then doing some reports on it. Okay, so again, I mentioned this is inside of Excel 2010 or up. I'm using Excel 2013 today, so I'm going to create a new workbook here, and I'm going to go over to my PowerPivot tab. If for some reason you don't see the PowerPivot tab after you've installed it, you can go under the File menu and under Options, and you'll find underneath the Add-ins section here, if you go look underneath COM add-ins, I know this is a lot of steps here that I'm going through, but this is how you can make sure all the add-ins that you've installed are properly available to you. And you should be able to see the Microsoft Office PowerPivot for Excel 2013. If you use the 2010 add-in, you should see that as well here. It's just a checkbox in case you don't see the tab. All right, so on my PowerPivot tab here, I'm going to tell it that I wanted to bring in and import new data. And the way I do that is I'm going to go under the Data Model section here and tell it I want to manage my PowerPivot model. So I'll select PowerPivot. You see it's loading a data model here in the bottom right. And now I'm able to tell it which data sources do I want to pull in information from. So I have a lot of options where I can pull in data from. I mentioned a few moments ago that really any kind of connection I can think of, any ODBC connection, any Oracle connection, Sybase, Teradata, Access. Heaven forbid you have to pull in data from Access. But if you have folks that are doing ad hoc reporting, they probably do have some Access databases laying around that they may need to pull in information from. So there's a lot of flexibility with the types of data sources that you can pull in. For our example today, I'm just going to be using SQL Server. And I'll connect to my local instance here. And I'll select one of my data warehouses here. Now again, you don't necessarily have to have a data warehouse to do PowerPivot. So you don't have to wait for IT to build out a full data warehouse for you. You could do this all on your other databases that you have available to you that would maybe typically be brought together into a data warehouse. So you're not limited here with what types of databases. And you have limited connectivity off to those data sources, so you shouldn't be too awfully concerned about bringing down any kind of transactional systems because you have very intermediate imports from those. Okay, so I get to now choose how do I want to bring in the data. Do I want to import by selecting the tables or views that I have inside my model or inside my data source, or do I want to write a query? If I'm coming from a more of an end-user perspective, I'd probably select the tables here. Now I'll pick on the tables that I'd like to bring in. You can just come through and pick off the ones you want. You can also select one of the tables and hit Select Related Tables in the bottom right, and it'll bring in any of the relationships that you have inside your model, especially if you're using SQL Server here. Now I do recommend here, you'll notice inside the model here, I would recommend going ahead and renaming these. You can see right now the friendly name gives you the ability to rename any of the tables that you're pulling in. I would like to rename these so that they don't have dim or fact on the table names here. I want to make it very user-friendly so it's really easy to understand. All right, and then I'll hit finish. Now it's going to actually import that data into Excel. So that was fairly quick that it brought in, but keep in mind I have a small amount of data here. Even with millions of rows of data though, it's able to handle that inside of Excel fairly quickly. All right, so I brought in some data inside of my PowerPivot Workbook. I could go through here and do several things if I wanted to modify it or if I wanted to be able to manage it, but I want to make this fairly simple for our example here. I would probably do some things to clean up our PowerPivot Workbook some, maybe hide some columns that the end users don't care about, but for our example, we'll leave it fairly simple. What we're going to do is we're going to create things like a hierarchy, and I'm going to hide things that maybe would be more confusing to end users than helpful. So to do this, I'm going to go over to my diagram view of my data. You can see I'm kind of hovering over my bottom right section. I could either select diagram view in the top right, or I can select it in the bottom, and it'll take me to more of a diagram view of my objects here. Now I mentioned a couple things we want to do here is I probably want to hide some of these columns that aren't very helpful to my end users. Things like the ID columns, those are meaningless to end users. Those are more internal purposes for my database. So I could come through here and multi-select the columns I want to hide, and then right-click and tell it that I want to hide these from the client tools. So now you can see it has these kind of grayed out columns, which indicates that they're hidden from the end users. I also want to create a hierarchy. So I'd like to create a hierarchy so that our date dimension here, for example, makes it easy for our users to drill into the year, see each of the months, and then also drill down to the day level. Now, if I wanted to do something like this, I could select the Maximize button, or I could just click the Create Hierarchy button, either one. I like to do the Maximize button first because it allows me to see a full screen or fuller screen view of my table here. Then I can tell it that I want to create a hierarchy, and I'll call this hierarchy Date Drill Down. Okay. So far everything that I've shown you shouldn't be too difficult for probably more of a power user. It takes a little bit extra responsibility to be able to handle PowerPivot because you need to understand relationships, understand your data source really well. But again, this is more of an ad hoc modeling tool here. All right, so I'm going to bring in things like my year into my hierarchy. I'll do month and date. Okay, so I've created a very quick hierarchy here that will allow my users to navigate through from the year level down to the month, down to the date. Okay, let's leave it at that now. So this isn't our session isn't devoted to PowerPivot. We could spend an entire 4 days talking about PowerPivot. But for our purposes, we want to focus more on the reporting piece here. So now that I have a basic model, there is one more piece I want to do to make sure that this thing sorts properly, because as of right now, actually it should sort properly. So let's go ahead and build out a report on this and see exactly what it's going to look like. So I flip back over to my data view, and the data view just gives you a list of each of the tables here. And now I'm ready to create a pivot table. So I'm going to actually create a report on this at this point. I'll select the pivot table button in the very top here. Tell it that I'll create this in, let's say, the existing workbook or worksheet that we're looking at right now. And then it's going to give me the ability to create a report very easily. So for example, our date drill down that we created earlier, I could select here, and I could bring in any of the sales information and be able to build a report off of this. So things like revenue, if I want to bring in revenue and see revenue across time, I can see 2010 was by far my best year. I can drill in, see each of the months, and drill in and go all the way down to the day level if I wanted to. Okay, looks like I got some kind of issue there. Interesting. So I'm only seeing 1 day for each month here, but that's okay. We can take a look at that later. Now that I have a report, or now that I've built out a basic report, I can save this also off to SharePoint. Now we talked about the benefit of having this inside SharePoint is it's going to allow me to schedule things like data refreshes. So if I wanted to, I could come out here and tell it that I want to save it to SharePoint, Save it to my PowerPivot gallery. Call this my PowerPivot example. It's now going to save that off into SharePoint, and then when I go look at my SharePoint site, I'll see that I have a new document inside my PowerPivot gallery called PowerPivot example here. And you'll see again it's rendering out a little thumbnail to be able to show me a quick image of what the workbook's going to look like. But I should be able to open this now and see that I still can stay interactive with this if I wanted to add some new measurements in here. This is all the Excel services functionality I showed you earlier. I could easily add in those new measurements here if I chose to. Okay. Now we also talked about another benefit to us here is that I could schedule data refreshes. You'll see on my PowerPivot workbook that we deployed out, we have 3 different options here. I can open this inside of an Excel workbook, so I can actually go open the Excel client tool again. I could schedule a data refresh or manage a data refresh, which you see listed right here. Or and the third option here, the middle option, is that I could create a PowerView workbook, which is what I'm going to show you last. But let's look at this manage data refresh first before we move on to PowerView. Under this Manage Data Refresh, you'll see that you can place this on a schedule so that it actually reaches out to my data source and schedules the refreshing of my data. It looks very similar to a SQL Server agent job scheduling functionality here, if you've ever messed with those, where I can tell it that I want to create a schedule, go ahead and enable a data refresh on this, tell it when I want it to be scheduled. So do I want this to be every weekday, or do I want it to happen on certain days of the week? And when do I want it to occur? Do I want it to occur during after business hours or a specific time? This after business hours is something that you actually set in the PowerPivot settings, so this PowerPivot configuration. I can tell it what is non-business hours. Okay. You could also tell it what account is it going to use to pull data from that refresh, from that data source. So what account is going to reach out to the data source and pull the new data back in? Okay. So once I schedule that data refresh or create the data refresh, you just hit OK, and then it'll automatically refresh my data during the time that I've selected here. Okay. All right, see there's a ton of questions, so I do want to show PowerView, and then I'll make sure I take the last bit of questions here. Now the last tool we're going to talk about for doing ad hoc reporting is PowerView. PowerView I actually did a full webinar on last week where we walked through building an end-to-end PowerView solution. Today we're going to talk a little bit more briefly about it and just talk about what it is in case you didn't watch that webinar last week, and how it can give you the ability to create some ad hoc reports. It's more of an ad hoc data exploration tool. You'll be able to, in a much more graphical sense, create reports similar to the pivot tables inside of Excel, but again, more graphical. So if you are comfortable doing Excel pivot tables, you'll be able to pick up PowerView very quickly. It's not too difficult to do. Now what you need to be able to do PowerView is at least SharePoint 2010 and SQL Server 2012. That's the requirements to do PowerView. And you also need to have Silverlight 5 to do it as well. Or if you have Excel 2013 and Silverlight 5, you can also do PowerPivot directly in the client tool. So I don't need to even leave Excel. I don't have to have SharePoint to do PowerView if and only if I have Excel 2013. Okay, so I'll show you this bottom one here, this Excel 2013, just to show to you where you could potentially do PowerView from inside of Excel, and then I'll show you the SharePoint version of it as well, because we're focused on SharePoint in this webinar. All right, so if I wanted to do PowerView inside of Excel, I would simply go to my Insert menu here and tell it I wanted to insert a PowerView report, and that's going to launch open a new tab or a new spreadsheet where I can start to create PowerView reports very easily here. Okay. Now for our demonstration, I want to leverage SharePoint, and the benefit I get from leveraging SharePoint is it's not relying so much on my client tools as much as it is the server, the SharePoint server. So I'm going to pull open my SharePoint site here. Okay. And let's try that again. Thought I already had this open, sorry guys. All right, so now what I'd like to do is I want to leverage that model that we created earlier. We created this model, and I'll probably look at the completed model that I have down here. We created this model off this Tailspin database. Now if I want to create a report off of it, I can use this Create PowerView Report option and it'll launch Open PowerView. I mentioned PowerView you're able to do inside of SharePoint as long as you have Silverlight 5 and SQL Server 2012. The other option, again, while this is loading here, is Excel 2013 has the capability of doing it all encompassing within the client tool. All right, so we're looking at PowerView here. We're going to create a basic report here within the next 5 minutes, and then I'll like to save some time for questions because I see there's a lot of them. PowerView is very, very easy to do because you'll notice here on the far right that it's very similar to Excel pivot tables. I'm going to select off the objects that I would like to include in my report. So for example, if I wanted to create a report that had the category of my sales, so I'll drill into product and say that I want to bring in the product category. And I'd also like to bring in the revenue, for example. Let's go to my sales table here and bring in revenue. And very quickly we'll be able to bring together some pretty good information on a report. Now you can modify, obviously this is pretty small to read right now. You can actually make the text a little larger if you prefer so you can see it better. There was a button up here in the top here that you can increase the text size. That's new with SharePoint 2013. So it's a little flexibility here, makes it a lot easier now. You can also change the type of visualization. So right now we're visualizing this as a tabular view of the data. If we would prefer to see this as a column chart, for example, we can simply go up to the Office ribbon at the very top and select that we want this to be a column chart. Now this will show us our category sales in a very nice column chart here. And we could also bring in other types of charts. So for example, if I wanted to see the profitability, and I wanted to see how profitability was across time. So I want to bring in my date dimension if I'm looking at time. And I want to see across all of my months, how was the profitability? So I can do this in something like a line chart to be able to see the trending of that data. You can easily resize these and move them however you'd like on your report. And this is how easy PowerView is to do. It really is kind of a drag and drop and resize things and tell what type of visualization you'd like to use here. So we've gotten a basic report here. The really neat thing about PowerView is it relies heavily on the model. So as long as your model has all the relationships created properly, I can easily interact with my chart here, for example, and it would modify how my other chart looks. So these guys are connected just by the relationships that exist in the model. And I can multi-select here and actually select multiple columns and see how each of those columns work together. So some really neat functionality that you have here. PowerView also allows for handling of images really nicely. So if you have images in your data, you could bring those in without a problem simply by selecting those image columns that you have. And let me also bring in my product name here and some of the other information about my product. And I'm able to visualize that information about my product in different types of visualizations. One of them is called a card. A card visualization allows you to give almost kind of like a baseball card look and feel here to your product or my image. And I'm able to see the name of my product, the image, and all the pertinent details about that product. And all these different objects that I have in my report all interact with each other still. I can select one of my columns here and it'll filter down everything else I have in my report. Okay? Really neat stuff that you can do here with PowerView. You can create multiple views inside PowerView as well. So if I wanted to, I could create a whole other view here and pull in something like some geography data, and I can actually do mapping here as well. So if I had data that was related to geography, in this case I have the state table that has the state name. I can map out things like the state name by selecting the map visualization, and I could map out things like my quantity sold on this map visualization here. Okay, so I can see where the most of my sales are occurring. Looks like in California and Florida, maybe Maine up here as well. I'm sorry, that's not Maine, but some in the Northeast as well. So I'm able to really narrow down where my sales are occurring, and I can zoom in and have some flexibility here as well. So that was actually New York up there. So really neat functionality here with inside PowerView. Now the other nice thing about PowerView is all these different things that we're looking at right now can easily be exported into PowerPoint. PowerPoint, yes, the slide deck tool. So if I like what I've created here, I could save it. Okay, I'll save this and call this PowerView example. I save this report off to the server, and I can also save it into something like a PowerPoint slide deck. Now this actually is probably one of the most interesting features because it takes this ad hoc reporting tool that lives inside SharePoint and brings it down to a presenting tool. So presenting like PowerPoint slide decks. So I can come down and say that I want to export this to a PowerPoint file. It's going to export all of these files down into PowerPoint, and it's going to ask me to save a PowerPoint presentation. So I'll call this my PowerPoint example. Now it saved this PowerPoint slide deck on my desktop, hopefully. Let's see, where did it save that? I didn't look very closely where I saved it. Let me try it one more time. I assumed I saved it on my desktop. I did, okay. So let's see, where did I put it? It's probably on my other screen. It is, it's on my other screen. All right, so let me open up my PowerPoint example here. And what this is going to show you is how you can actually keep a PowerView report interactive inside of a PowerPoint slide deck. So if I go into presentation mode here, you'll see that there's a little button in the bottom right called Interact. And if I select that Interact button, it'll actually reach out into the server. I'll need to throw in my credentials here one more time. Okay. I need to type right as well. Spelling does count. There we go. All right, so if I click that Interact button, it'll actually reach out into the server and pull back the data and keep a connection between it so I can interact with my reports just as if I was on the SharePoint site. So for example, I'm in a PowerPoint slide deck here, but I can still interact with my report as if I was on the server. So very, very neat functionality here. Now if you're interested in more of these, like PowerPoint, I did a webinar last week that specifically walked through each of the different components of PowerView. So you'll see a little bit more detail in what I had time to show here today on PowerView if you watch that one. Okay. So Melissa, I think I want to leave the last 5 minutes or so here for questions because I've been seeing them roll in here. I want to make sure I'm able to get to a lot of them because there's a lot of different things we talked about.
Perfect. Do you want to get started on that?
Yeah, let's go ahead. Let's do it. I'll put my contact info up here in case anyone wants to reach out with me with questions they think of later. So you're more than welcome to reach out to me that way. But yeah, let's go ahead and go with questions.